So this panel is on the implications of blockchain and crypto technology. Now, I really want to commend the first crypto panel because they inevitably touched on a lot of this and really opened up the ethical issues around where blockchain is going. And in particular, the audience questions really, almost all of them kind of hit on, okay, but for what? And what about the expending of electrical energy, etc.? And so, yeah, I will give a brief intro of our panel here, and then we're going to just kind of open a discussion around this stuff. So, right next to me is Vinay Gupta, formerly of the Ethereum Foundation, and now the CEO of Materium. Is it Materium? Yeah. Materium, which is smart contract legal enforcement for the blockchain. And in my experience as a member of the crypto community, a tireless advocate for decentralization for global social good. Next to him is Jake Vartanian, the founder of Native, which Shannon mentioned earlier, and Cryptodex, who has focused on token design and economic models, in particular using this emerging tech to help communities be more aware of the immense value they already hold. I think that's a crucial thing for both the crypto and psychedelic communities, is that a lot of human value is already in existence and being exploited by corporations, centralized players, etc. And so it's already there. And next to him is Max Borders, the executive director of Social Evolution, which is a nonprofit startup dedicated to liberating people and solving social problems through innovation. He's also the co-founder of Voice and Exit Conference / Festival. It is both. And he's the author of The Social Singularity, which is coming out this summer. And then finally, we have Gary Lachance, who, like me, flew down here from Vancouver. He is similarly tireless advocate of radical decentralization for nearly a decade, with production from filmmaking, writing, and community organizing. He was the MC and wrangler for the Dialogues on Decentralization at Camp Decentral at Burning Man this past year. And he is the spiritual advisor and co-founder of the Decentralized Dance Party, which is a roaming street party that translates the ideas of decentralization and the ethos behind them to often passersby on the street, pulling a lot of new converts to these ideas just through capital P partying of a radical shared community experience. I'm biased because I too am a co-organizer of the Decentralized Dance Party, the Deacon of Decentralization, and I am a co-organizer at Decontrol Community Commons, which Alex or Doge from the previous panel, he's also an organizer there, and we do free community education on blockchain. And apparently you will all hear me later at the party rapping about crypto as Ms. Gnu. So that is us as a panel, and I'm just going to launch right into well, as I said, the previous panel really already touched on this question. I think it's, if you're talking implications of crypto, it is the key question is, what are the new freedoms that this technology enables? And what are the greatest potential threats to that freedom? I think it's really important to look at both sides of the coin here. So I'm curious if anyone wants to kind of jump in on what's most exciting to you, not like beyond just finance. What is most exciting that we could see in the next couple of years?
Guess I could jump in there. I agree with John McAfee, who stated that the blockchain is the most impactful invention since agriculture. I believe that before that time we were all kind of decentralized tribes. Agriculture allowed centralized power structures, monetary systems to be devised and rise up. And now with the advent of the blockchain, there is this enormous potential to decentralize the world once again. And the moment I got turned on to Bitcoin in 2011, I knew this is what we've been waiting for throughout human history. Extremely excited, and yeah, I think it is definitely the key to uniting the entire world. It may not appear that way at first glance, but if you really start delving into what is centralization, what are centralized power structures, and that's what we've all grown up in: centralized monetary, healthcare, education. Like, instead of an education system where you're encouraged to look inward and connect with people, you're divided, atomized, and you obey this authority figure at the front of the classroom, compete against each other. It's not about cooperation. It's not about how do we build a better world? It's memorize and regurgitate. And if you start looking, a lot of our systems are that way. And now we have this emergent movement that I find extremely heartening and exciting. And with the DDP, we've done our best to embody that ethos and bring people together. Sorry. I'll leave into Max.
Yeah. I would like to riff on that as well. I think that was well said. For me, the most exciting prospect for this is the end of politics as we know it. I think if we think is given the sort of political structure we have, which is really centralized and hierarchical, what we're doing in participating in that system is reinforcing it. So, for example, the great old Canadian thinker Marshall McLuhan said, "We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us." And here you can also add, we shape our rules, and our rules shape us. With the blockchain, we have the confluence of rules and tools. These are coming together suddenly to completely transform the incentive systems that humanity can operate under. And in that respect, this old hierarchical centralized system where tribes, ideological tribes, fight with each other in sort of zero or even negative sum game to let people borrow power only to abuse it, that has the potential to go away. This is actually the message of psychedelics. That interestingly is that I believe, in one of the great overlaps, is you're left with this ineffable sense or knowledge of our profound human connectedness. And what is blocking that, I believe, is the sort of hierarchical systems we have to live under today. So the blockchain, I believe, will help us underthrow that system.
So, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that a blockchain is simply a public, verifiable ledger of transactions. When you really break it down, a blockchain is just that. It's not magic, it's not like some crazy thing, but just public access to what's going on. That's verifiable. But what that actually opens up, and as Amir in the last panel rightly pointed out, we are barely at the beginnings of all this, but the potential that this could have over many years to come can enable so many new modalities of being. We've been so stuck in one form of monetary system, kind of like you were saying, for so long, where everybody is almost like a slave to the system, to the few people at the top who control most of the wealth. And people are just looking to get a little piece of that wealth so they can sustain themselves and survive. But why not be able to create your own system? Why not be able to design your own economic incentives and create a system that is more in resonance with the people around you, that actually reflects the value that you're creating? The value structures of today really only have a very narrow scope of how value is created, and generally that is through the use of our direct labor. But why does it have to be that way? There can be, we're starting to see now how powerful memes can be. There's whole economies starting to generate around the power of memes, around curating quality content that people are interested in. So I think really just sharing a lot about giving people the opportunity to do the things that they love and have that value reflected through a combination of tokenization, of blockchain, of cryptocurrency. It was what will enable a more sustainable and beautiful future, hopefully over the long term.
So I'm kind of an old guy, and I'm kind of a pragmatist. Where I see the real opportunity for change here is that we might be able to do for the physical world what Google did for the world of information over the past 15 years. So information went from being scarce, difficult to find, difficult to access, hard to contextualize, expensive to manipulate, hard to synchronize and coordinate, to being really cheap and easy, right? When was the last time you had a problem that was an information scarcity problem? You just kind of type it into Google and you find a link and you follow the link and there's this thing there and there's some names, you Google the names, and pretty soon more or less any kind of access to information problem you have is solved, and usually it's at zero cost. Worst case, you're going to pay $3.50 for a PDF. So where I see blockchain going is it's kind of a way of teaching computers about the material world. The rigidity, the hardness, the ledger. This is the fundamental interface between information systems and materiality, and it's been that way for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years, right? Going back to clay seals. So what I see is that blockchain could finally figure out how to track the material world, haul it inside of the digital world, and then give us the opportunity to do things like search the material world. Right? You're short of a bolt for your bicycle, you have no way of knowing that your next door neighbor has a spare bolt that will solve the problem. And in a world where our transactions are going across these kinds of shared digital media, you get the ability to say, hey, you have a bolt, can I give you $1.50? I really need that this afternoon. And you wind up with this kind of fluidization of the world of the physical in a way that's entirely akin to what happened for the digital over the last 50 years. And I think the blockchain is this critical bridge that we need to be able to bring this kind of reach, the searchability, the traceability, the discoverability directly into the material. I can't even guess what kinds of social change come out the back of that process, but I think it's going to be kind of cool.
Thank you. Yeah, and building on, I think of that as, and with the particular use of the example of Google, the internet started to enable us searching for relevant information from the real world, being logged in a really, up until now, old-fashioned way on the internet. Someone had to compile it all together and put it on their own server. And so there has always been a really strong incentivization for that person who is controlling the central database of information, all the bolts, etc., to charge a ridiculous amount for access to that. So there starts to be, and it was mentioned on the first panel, the idea of these sorts of exchanges of information happening in the background and becoming largely automated not only leads to a greater degree of convenience, but it removes the intermediary layers of charging for access to that. So it's come up numerous times today that money and fundraising are an issue, and that classically access to funding has been the choke point for causes that are not heartily endorsed by nation states or centralized players. So another question I want to transition us into, and this was yet again really touched on, the beginnings of it were touched on by the first panel, is how do ICOs and the Internet of Money, maybe not ICOs so much because as we touched on, much of it is kind of a cash grab right now, but ICOs are built on the idea of tokenizing projects, selling potential future access to systems, etc. So how do tokenizing and really it's just crowdfunding, how do these help us fundraise for topics that may be maybe threatening to centralized institutions like psychedelic research? Like how have we seen crowdfunding in the past couple of years? Oh, hey, Jerome, what up? How have we seen crowdfunding, like, can you think of some concrete examples that really changed the game in terms of, hey, we have the keys here as a community, we can decide to fundraise?
Ethereum was a pretty good one.
Yeah, that worked quite well. But with all this stuff, I kind of feel like we've gotten a little stymied on the crowdfunding side, because the utility token model doesn't really distribute power, it only distributes wealth. If we could actually do equity crowdfunding, so you could do extremely broad shareholder democracy, 100,000 people fund it, 100,000 people at the vote on what happens, I think we get much more of the benefit from these kind of crowdfunding structures. But the problem is that the nation-state regulatory framework only lets us do things like utility tokens, and even that's in some danger. So we're in a position where the really interesting stuff we can't quite get to because of what's theoretically shareholder protection. I found it quite frustrating. I wish we could find a way around that.
And I don't want to. I am very sanguine about this space. I realize that there's going to be a great fallout. We're going to fall into the trough of disillusionment probably here pretty soon. I think one of the greatest threats to this, and going back to the initial question about threats to the ICO space in particular, is this duality that we have, this yin and yang that we have to pay attention to, and that is money on the one hand as the lifeblood of this space, That might be uncomfortable for some people here who are very giving, but let's face it, money makes the world go round in a lot of respects. Money is a kind of energy for making things happen. Then there's the other part of this, and that's mission. And I think there's a misalignment right now between mission and money for some of these ICO projects, and we're just getting a lot of people who are out for a quick buck. And the irrational exuberance about getting in, getting your little piece of this, it could risk the edifice of this to the point that the crash that could come soon is going to leave people with a bad taste in their mouths for quite a while, and it'll also make the powers of decentralization feel a sense of license for coming in and doing whatever the hell they want to with the regulatory state, which Vinay mentioned just a minute ago. So I think for the folks here who tend to be mission focused first, lead with that sense of mission when you're evaluating something, say an investment, an early investment in a token. Make that another one of the dimensions that you're looking for. Are these people really about solving a real human problem? Even if it's a hard human problem, that sense of mission, you're more likely to get someone who's not scamming you if that passion for that mission resonates in what you're looking at. And speaking of mission driven, I'm looking at Matt McKibben over here, and he's one of them. He's one of the good ones. Woo! Yeah.
So, I think that we're in the very, very infancy of this whole entire thing. And while we're in the infancy of any sort of thing, it's going to be a very bumpy road. None of these things happen very smoothly over time, and especially when we're talking about the most impactful transformation of our entire monetary way of being and system that's been in place for hundreds of years. When we're talking about a complete redesign and restructure of that, there's a lot of things that come into play there. And of course, there's going to be some scammers. Of course, there's going to be a lot of bad projects, a lot of people who are out there to get money, and there's a lot of people who are trying to put money into projects right now. Sometimes you get good ones, sometimes you get bad ones. Do your own research, figure out which ones you care about, which ones maybe are ethically right in our own eyes, and choose those and really believe in those projects rather than going for a quick flip to make whatever percentage. But one of the most formative experiences of my own life and how I view a lot of this stuff was I was in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I was sitting in a mosque with a young man, and he was explaining to me how his whole family was kind of not in the picture. He didn't have an identification card. He basically had nothing. He was basically alone, hung out in this mosque all day long, and he had on a piece of paper an entire business plan to write out to create an ice cream stand. And the total cost of what this dude needed was about $80 US. This is for a freezer, ice cream, cups, etc. And he was explaining to me how he's not actually able to get the equivalent of $80 to start this ice cream stand. And I'm coming from a, upper class suburban golf course neighborhood, and I'm like, what do you mean you can't get $80? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So I gave him the $80, and I was like, we'll kind of figure this out over time. But we started video chatting every single day. He's like, hey, here's the progress, here's what's going on. By the end of it, he had the equivalent of $220 after selling all of his ice creams. And he was going to give me back $95. But what we ran into was imposed barriers set up by this monetary system that we're involved in right now, where there was actually no way for him to send money back to me from Indonesia, except through Western Union, which would take a 30 to 35%, given the circumstances, commission on this situation, which makes it not feasible to do these microloans to people who are looking for such a small amount of money. And that really just hit me in a really heart sort of place. It's like, I can't even help people unless I'm physically next to them, because I'm not able to transfer the energy that I've accumulated to them and share, make that wealth as fluid as it can possibly be. So that's, for me, kind of the area that I think will have the most meaningful impact over time at that really local, sustainable, individual level, and empowering people to a degree that they haven't been able to do before.
Say that story opens up, it's not an ICO per se, but the possibility for fractional ownership of anything in the world you can think of, whether it's real estate, someone's education, roads. Like, this is a way to potentially help countries develop without centralized organizations sending money to another centralized organization, and there's all the issues of corruption. If we can directly connect people on a peer-to-peer level to develop, for example, a well somewhere that needs a well, and beam them crypto, they can build it and then establish a reputation as they go along. It's really easy to take a photo or a video and just keep going from there, and I think that's going to be immensely powerful as we move ahead.
Agreed. And yeah, both of those points, they kind of flesh out for me, building on what Vinay had pointed out earlier, that so token ownership does not currently give someone any rights, and with ICOs and things like that, they are very careful because of the regulatory challenges. They're very careful to outline like 4 pages of, this means basically nothing. You get nothing. We guarantee nothing. Because they have to do that to cover their asses.
And it's completely nerfing our ability to build new social structures using these value streams.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if we could have rules to those games that would give people political processes that they could pool their money and then have governance attached and all the rest of this stuff, the regulation has essentially killed the ability to build our custom governance structures to manage the asset pools that we're generating.
Absolutely.
It's infuriating.
Well, and that this is the way rigged games evolve and persist in time. You know, we often talk about the economy as a rigged game that benefits the few, the plutocrats at the top, as it were. And everybody's familiar with that sort of language, and it's actually quite true. The thing about using the sort of the effort to mitigate or ban even risk is that justification ends up creating these captured regulatory industries that end up creating the rigged game. And this is known as the Bootleggers and Baptist Coalitions. That problem we're going to continue to see in this space if we're not careful. Thankfully, though, the decentralization is sort of a Pandora's box that's been opened, depending on your perspective, or a genie that's been let out of the bottle. It's exceedingly difficult to put back in time. You can create regulatory setbacks for this, but I think the long-term vision of this is such that I'm optimistic, and I think everyone up here is as well.
Yeah.
I just met a guy earlier today. He's creating his own independent ICO rating system, so we can take responsibility for our own communities and build these trusted systems and just come together. Hopefully we can avoid unnecessary intrusions.
I think, Max kind of touched on this, that what the decentralization and the redesigning of economies really opens up is the ability to have a choice, to have a say in which systems we want to participate in, rather than being victim to one specific sort of situation. But when we have the opportunity to choose where to allocate our wealth, where to allocate our attention, where to allocate our energy, then we can ensure that the capital that is flowing through those systems is actually being allocated into things that we actually care about, rather than ending up in situations like what we've seen over the past couple of years with the Dakota pipeline, to name one of many. So when I think a lot of that has to do with there's sort of a greed element that kind of has to get worked through in some of these models, because they might not provide the largest possible returns instantly, but what they will provide, if done correctly or effectively, will provide a much more like emotionally satisfying feeling for the people who who are involved, because they're actually getting something back besides this denomination of currency that, beyond paper, beyond it being a piece of paper that gets you the things that you want, has no meaning, has no sense of bonding between the people who are transacting with that tool.
So it seems it's come up here, and it's come up in like every conversation I have every day at our hackerspace. So governance and community. These are things that, in my peripheral understanding, the psychedelic community is strongly all about, and that's really what looking inside oneself allows you to understand how you want to connect with others, etc. So the first use case of blockchain, Bitcoin. The Bitcoin core team has always had a very code is law perspective of the technology will solve itself. You know, we shouldn't have human interference, discussions about governance, etc. And that has led to some interesting things. And then one of its successors, the Ethereum blockchain, has the Ethereum Foundation, which has really explicit arguments, discussions, etc. around this, has added that layer. I feel, just my perspective on this is that the Ethereum Foundation team has made the statement that yes, we are going to govern, we are going to talk about governance, and that has its own problems. So I'm just, what lessons do y'all feel we've learned with these struggles? Maxie, clearly.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, and I hate to even skip in front of Vinay because he was working in the Ethereum Foundation. But I run an annual event in Austin called Voice and Exit, which is, I'd love all of you to come, obviously. But we named it that for a reason, because I believe that Voice and Exit is really the human algorithm. If you're in an existing system, you exercise voice to try to change it, right? You say, hey, this stinks, let's try to change this. But if you can't get consensus, or you can't persuade others to do that, to make the change, then you have to exercise something else, some other peaceful power, which is exit. You leave it and you try something new. This human algorithm, the essence of this revolution that we're talking about, is really radical experimentation in community building. Okay? It's really about designing systems of governance, intentional communities. Some could be far more egalitarian in terms of outcome and the way just resources are distributed. Some may be slightly less egalitarian and more proportional to your labor inputs and your contribution and so on. But all these different systems of governance that are now going to be possible with the decentralization revolution means that we needn't argue so much over theory. It's almost like the death of political theory. It's saying, put your theory where your put your community where your theory is. Put your whatever where your mouth is. It's really about getting out there and trying this stuff and seeing if your community is sustainable, if it's fiscally sustainable, if you can build your community bigger than Dunbar's number? Can you do it across space and time, virtually? How scalable is it? What are your governance rules? This idea of competitive governance makes some of these ideological wars and conversations that we have, at the very least, radically localized and internal to those communities. So that no longer are we living in this condition of Democrat, Republican, and a couple of outliers. We really are about trying out new things as human beings together and seeing what works and attracting others into our orbit. And that is the most profound aspect of competitive governance that I see, but I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
So, although Ethereum Foundation in theory maybe does some governance of Ethereum as a project, in practice, if they designed a new logo for Ethereum and then tried to get people to use it, it probably would fail, right? They don't actually have any kind of infrastructure for getting people to do things they don't want to do. Vitalik can persuade based on being really cool, but there's actually no way to really manage open source projects in a way that pushes them in a direction they don't want to go. And that's even more true for blockchain projects, because the miners are going to do what they damn well like, and at that point the network is going to do what the miners tell it to do. So there's not much you can do to steer these networks. And I think that is a problem in some cases, right? So if you look at, for example, the parity hack, you've got an enormous amount of ether tied up. And you'd sort of think that there would be some kind of explicit mechanism for making a political decision about that, or a judicial decision even. But in practice, it's very indirect, and there are proposals and counter-proposals and discussions, and maybe we'll get around to it, and all this kind of stuff. It's very structuralist. And structuralist is exactly what you don't want in your governance systems. You want them explicit, you want them defined, you want them fair, you want them forcibly egalitarian. You don't want to be in a position where the shiny people have disproportionate interest over the dull people. But if you're really going to design governance, it has to be for everybody on an equitable basis, and informal systems are capable of generating that kind of inclusion. So I think that there's a real tension between informal community-based governance approaches and genuine inclusivity, because communities are always at some level a popularity contest, and there's always an in-group and an out-group. And the reason that we have formalized the law is it provides genuinely egalitarian spaces. I think that is a tension we're going to keep feeling in the blockchain space until eventually we manage to ingest law so that we can provide this kind of genuine egalitarianism at a hard-coded level.
So yeah, I definitely wholeheartedly agree with Max. And there's a funny joke in the blockchain community where we call democracy the original 51% attack, where the majority of people get the voting power instead of mining power. They can impose their vision of the future on the rest of them. So I'm very excited at the possibility of enacting new opt-in communities and competing governance, and it's a really interesting time because you have this confluence of all these technologies. Like you can 3D print a house, decentralized manufacturing for $10,000, decentralized energy, solar power, and we can build new communities from scratch, and you can use that energy to power all kinds of water purification, food growing with vertical gardening. So we can build new communities, places where where it didn't make sense to live before, and experiment with new forms of governing and reorient ourselves into communities where we have shared values and visions for the future, and I think that's going to be pretty awesome. And that's what we're doing right here. So.
The huge opening up, what we can remember. So the huge opening up is desalination, right? Once you can do cheap desalination, you can take all the dry coasts, like all the way around Australia and Namibia, these kind of places. They're basically uninhabited because there's no fresh water, and there's basically no way of getting food in there in large quantities. So, with things like, ultra cheap solar panels and graphene-based desalination filters, you can do very, very cheap desalination quite soon, 5-10 years, maybe sooner. And that opens up gigantic quantities of absolutely fantastic real estate that currently has essentially zero market value because they're pre-desalination economy. There's just no way to build any kind of human habitation there. So I think we're going to see a real kind of Cambrian explosion of things like intentional communities all the way around these dry coasts, based on basically turning up with a sea container of desalination equipment. You establish water, then you establish agriculture, then you bring in populations. I think we're going to see some really interesting cultures up those coasts, particularly Australia, because it's enormous and it's nearly infinite land that's currently uninhabitable and currently unwanted, that's about to suddenly snap into utility. I'm super excited. I think it's going to be much easier than going to Mars for roughly equivalent levels of crazy.
So, community and governance. E.F. Schumacher wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Matter. And there's one part in there where he talks about the ideal size of a city and how many people you can actually manage and actually understand their needs and their desires and what should be happening next in these areas. I'm not 100% sure if this is right, but I believe he said that 300,000 was kind of the optimal sort of size for one of these kind of cities or villages that can still be reasonably maintained while getting enough input from all of the people who are involved in that community, village, city, whatever you want to call it. So I think that the kind of finding this balance between size and what the technology's current state actually is, and what it's able to actually do right now in terms of providing those governance functions. Right now we're just seeing some of the core foundational infrastructure layers of things being built on top of Ethereum right now. For me, Bancor is one of the most incredible projects to date, really tapping into Frederick Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, and a lot of the brilliant thinking that they've already done around these decentralized global liquidity networks and how to plug communities into those networks, allowing them to build reserves that make their tokens instantly liquid and convertible with just a couple of clicks. So I think when we can start to use those, get some experiments out there, really just try some stuff and see, can we use a Bancor economic model with a Aragon or a Ethereum governance model to do basic things like, can we get a proposal funded? Can we do a vote?
Yeah.
If we can do that at a very basic level between even 10 people, I think that's awesome.
And this is collective action problems, right? You build new machinery for solving collective action problems, you get new collective actions. And we haven't had a real innovation on that since the invention of open source. That was the last big breakthrough on collective action. Commons-based peer production. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, thank you.
Oh yeah, that's Yochai Bancor. Yochai Bancor is an economist who wrote a book called The Wealth of Networks, studying things like why Wikipedia works or why Linux works. And a lot of the lessons from that come across into the blockchain space, because now we have new kinds of social machinery and new kinds of economic machinery for building essentially mechanisms for coordinating collective action. And collective action is how you get roads and schools and hospitals. It's how you get all the things that no one single person wants to pay for, but that a group of people need to come into existence. Mechanism design for solving collective action problems is historically a really slow-moving space. But then you take the smart contract and you kind of set it right in the middle, and now you can just knock out a 50-line program that describes how you want to solve the collective action problem, run it up the flagpole, and see who sends the refit. It's a really new experimental mechanism by which we can begin to design collective action solutions.
Okay, before I head into our last question for the panel, I wanted to just, for anyone who is new to these concepts, clarify a couple things that came up, because Max mentioned Dunbar's number earlier, and now we've kind of cycled around to similar concepts, and it's a pretty cool thing. Dunbar's number, if I'm recalling correctly, is there's a theory that around 150 people in a group is where anonymity becomes a thing, where you no longer really necessarily know every single one of your neighbors. And this is something that I find also really interesting when you get into festival culture and stuff. We have huge festivals where we somehow, because of the frame of mind we enter it with or whatnot, we ignore that anonymity and kind of explore trust despite anonymity. But yeah, if you want to know more about kind of the foundations of some of the decentralization concepts, Dunbar's number is where we start to have potential struggles with trust, because we no longer can vouch for every single member of the group. And then Gary had mentioned the concept of opt-in versus opt-out. We are, in our internet lives, we are so bombarded with opt-out structures that I think it starts to feel normal to not have autonomy and power as tech users. So opt-in is when you sign up for a thing and it says, do you want us to email you? And if you don't select yes, then you don't get emailed. Most things in our centralized tech world are opt-out, where it's sign up in order to access this service. Cool. Now you're going to be bombarded with emails, and you have to go into each of them and sign in and say, hey, stop emailing me. I never even agreed to this in the first place. So again, most of the mission in the decentralization community is about that freedom, autonomy, and all of that from the outset for all of us as both users of technologies and participants in community. So I guess the open-ended kind of ending question, which will wrap up the crypto section of the day and lead us into the final unifying segment of crypto and psychedelic after the break is, what do you each consider the most exciting or important next area we're tackling with decentralized tech protocols? Eric?
I guess one that pops to mind is mesh networks. Right now you're seeing a lot of stuff going on regarding net neutrality, and every 4 years or I don't know how it all works, but you never know when they're going to lock down the internet and take it away. And MeshNet, the way I got turned on to it was the one laptop per child program, which started a long time ago for developing countries where there's no internet at all, but a classroom full of students, they can link their laptops together. I thought that was really neat. And with the Decentralized dance party, we have hundreds of people carrying boom boxes and then a FM radio transmitter and a backpack. It beams out the music and we can DJ through it and speak to hundreds or thousands of people. And that's a really amazing technology. But the next evolution of that would be decentralized mesh networks, which is also hugely beneficial if there's a natural disaster, power goes out, or if there's some sort of authoritarian regime who doesn't necessarily want you connecting with others. But I think if we have a decentralized, kind of self-healing, battery-powered mesh network that can do voice, music, information, and connect people in whatever ways they want to connect, that can't be locked down by an authoritarian regime, I'm very excited about that. And hopefully it's going to be coming pretty soon.
This is a tough question for me, and part of it is because I need to really flesh this out with techies. Probably, maybe I can grab one of you guys afterwards and talk about it. But I think there are two really interesting areas in this space that are interesting concepts. The first one that we're all really familiar with is disintermediation, and that's a fancy term for taking out middlemen, so that we can have established sort of peer-to-peer relationships at the level of the network. Okay, that process through smart contracts is sort of like a vending machine. Okay, that's the metaphor I've heard for it, and that means that peers have a very simple contract. They can establish relationships without intermediaries. But I don't think that that covers a whole set of use cases. That then there's going to be a whole other set of use cases that you might refer to as hypermediation. Okay, which is that we want a human fractal to emerge with a series of checkers, a series of people bringing to bear their different capabilities and their oversight and their reputations, and how we construct identities online with respect to these human fractals, that they have an integrity that holds up systems. If you need more human intercession, you're not thinking of the relationship as being like a vending machine, but rather something that requires agency. I'm interested in whatever is next with those technologies. It's not as rigid as I think as the blockchain, but I could be wrong, and I think the techies will disabuse me of that if I am wrong.
Yeah, and you'll get hybrid systems. There'll be a really hard part that handles the kind of critical namespaces. Then you get softer parts with things like Lightning networks. And right now we only just learned how to make really rigid software that's as difficult to break as the real world is. And so we're very obsessed by the things like immutability and the rest of that. Later on, what you'll discover is you want 20 or 30% of the system to be immutable. Then you want some areas where you kind of flexible and semi-permeable, and then you've got kind of this messaging stuff where you don't really care what happens after it's delivered, this kind of thing. I think you'll see much more integration and hybridization as we go. So in terms of the big goal thing, I think we're going to ICO the Mars mission, right? I mean, you've got on the order of $600 billion of risk capital floating around. It could easily be 4 times that. And that to me looks like the pool of money globally, which has the kind of ambition and the kind of willingness to understand the future and then manifest it. that you would require for sending 500,000 or 1 million human beings to Mars. You know, that's where you get the kind of 20, 40, $80 billion single slab that goes into Musk's hands to go and build out the Mars colonial transporter infrastructure. Once that stuff is paid for, once you've got the infrastructure built, then you get into the domain where you can start selling the tickets and there's actually a thing there. But the initial risk capital to become an interplanetary and then an interstellar species is almost certainly going to come out of the crypto community because I don't think anybody else has the vision of the reach.
Yes.
That's our job.
How about yourself?
So when I first got into crypto and started sharing a little bit about Bitcoin and how I saw that it could potentially impact the world in the future, initially there was a lot of negative responses and really just like aversion to hearing what I was actually saying and really just going back to those like comfort zones with people and just assuming that I was, you know, doing drugs or using drugs or funding terrorism or guns or whatever sort of easy escape there was as to why I would be actually using this decentralized anonymous monetary system when really my intentions were actually quite pure, at least in my own mind at least. So I think now, I mean, since then, now we have Bloomberg, CNBC opening up dedicated crypto shops. We have Goldman Sachs opening up a trading desk in June or July or something like that. Robinhood trading app has 1 million plus people already ready to start trading when they open. You know, we're starting to see these important, like, fundamental applications to get people involved in these systems really starting to open up and being accessible. You know, you don't have to, you know, one of my favorite quotes from anybody in this space is in Puerto Rico, and this, after explaining security to somebody, this lady stood up and was like, "So you're telling me the only thing I can do in this situation to keep my money safe is to take my private key and shove it up my butthole?" And I was like, wow, like that is really accurate. And you know, so I'm really happy that like those systems are starting to get a little bit easier, and that more and more people are showing up to events and, you know, educating themselves. You know, as Amir pointed out, it truly is a self-education process, and the beauty of it is that everybody these days has a computer, and you can go online and you can Google stuff and you can read about stuff and, you know, do whatever you want to learn about. So, you know, I think that my main thing right now is that like it's all a process, and like being able to share some of my knowledge and learn from other people, especially at events like these where it infuses such two fundamental components of my life into one event and brings together such beautiful people. It's just truly a blessing to be here, and huge thank you to Matt, Mike, and everybody else who put all this together.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who organized this, and thank you to everyone speaking today. And I already have been learning a lot here, and it's really great to see these communities come together. Like has been mentioned, these communities already interrelate really strongly, so it's great to kind of have an ideation session. And from what I've heard, the last final set of two panels is really about ideating out loud and really navigating where we go next. So this whole group is here to do that together. And as a final note, I just want to throw in there, the audience member had brought up for the first panel the really good point and question about inclusivity and diversity in the blockchain space. When we run events that are about trading shitcoins and stuff like that, it is majority white dudes. When we talk about these concepts, about like how are we going to change the world, there is a diverse turnout. So I really think crypto has struggled by being kind of pigeonholed as, oh, it's just about trading coins. I think the best way we can open the space is to talk about all of these things and really proselytize global change.